sponsors are, on the back of this sheet, NBRH, St. J Academy, Fairbanks Scales, Goodyear Pharmacy, Community National Bank, White's Market, and Presumption Bank. And so I know Frank handed out his letters, so if you all just send a letter. Was it to White Market this time?
Fairbanks Scales,
Fairbanks
sponsor of the week.
This afternoon we have Alan Gilbert with us. Alan's the Executive Director of the ACLU of Vermont. He's been there since 2004. Prior to that he was a college professor.
Teacher, lecturer, yeah.
Lecturer. He's been a newspaper reporter and a number of other things. I'll just read. Alan Gilbert has been Executive Director of the ACLU of Vermont since 2004. Before that, he worked as in journalism as a reporter for the Rutland Herald and Times-Argus. He's taught writing at several colleges and lived abroad for 3 years, teaching American Studies at a German university. For 14 years, he was a principal in the Press Kit of Montpelier, a communications and public policy research firm. Mr. Gilbert has also been a commentator on Vermont Public Radio. He holds a bachelor's degree in history from Harvard and a master's degree from William & Mary. Mr. Gilbert.
Thanks. So it's on. Is it too loud? No? Okay. So last year I was asked to speak about privacy. It was about the same time this year, actually. And when I started working on today's presentation, I realized it kind of feels like I've been talking about privacy for a year, if not more. And let me tell you the reason why privacy recently has really been on my mind. It's all about this. You might wonder, what is that antique item on the screen? And that's an old mortar and pestle, the way that drugs used to be prepared. And the reason that I put that up there is that when the 2012 legislature convened last year, one of the first bills that they took up was a bill that was going to open up your prescription drug records, your prescription drug e-records to police without the police first getting a warrant. I don't know if you know this or not, but your drug records, the records of Schedule 2 through 4 prescription drugs you get at a pharmacy, all that information is actually entered into an electronic database at the time that you pick up the prescription. And the database was built by the Vermont Health Department about 6 years ago. And again, it contains what's called Schedule 2 through 4 drugs. And those are the drugs that are regulated by the FDA, the Federal Drug Administration. And they're the ones that can be strongly addictive, everything from opiates, morphine, they're Schedule 2 drugs, up to Schedule 4 drugs, which can be mildly addictive, usually because they're much lesser concentrations of stronger drugs. So certain cough medicines, for example, actually classify as Schedule 4 drugs. Schedule 1 drugs, just so you know it, are illegal substances. So marijuana is on there, meth is on there, LSD is on there, all those things that you're not supposed to have. But Schedule 2 through 4 are legal drugs, but they are considered to be addictive if they're abused. What happens in this database is the prescription that you get is entered with your name, your address, your age, what the dosage is, when you're getting it, whether you got a refill. And the idea is that doctors are supposed to check the e-database whenever they prescribe something for you, and they are supposed to do it for 2 reasons. They're supposed to do it to make sure they're not prescribing something that could have an adverse interaction with another drug. And they're also supposed to check it to make sure that you're not developing some sort of addiction to drugs, that you're not coming into the pharmacy frequently after you've picked up a bottle of pills and you come in and say, I need a refill because my pain is still there. And you keep doing this and doing this. And many people, you've probably been reading in Vermont, have actually become addicted to drugs like oxycodone is one of the most usual ones. So this fight over whether police should be able to access your prescription drug records without first getting a warrant, without having evidence that you had committed a crime, that you had fraudulently obtained drugs, for example, this actually became one of the biggest issues of the legislature last year. In the Senate, this is often how laws are really made in Montpelier. It's not people sitting orderly in rows and desks. This is actually a group of people huddled towards the front of the Senate chamber trying to work out their differences so they can proceed in getting a majority of people to approve a certain bill. And it was actually the Senate that was very strong in its approval for warrantless access. They had a powerful ally, the governor, Governor Shumlin, has been very much in favor of police having access to our drug records without a warrant. And it turned into a very public, nasty fight. The governor held several different press conferences, and he would trot out supporters of the bill and usually mention by name the opponents. Most of the opponents were over in the other chamber. This is the House, and as you can see, things in the House kind of get done the same way they get done in the Senate. Not as orderly as you might think. This was a scene last year. I believe it might have even been in during the fight over the warrantless access, where there was a question of the procedure, and there was a quick recess called, and the key players in the debate had to approach the speaker's podium. In the end, it was the House that was against warrantless access, and they actually held firm. The House said, sure, police can have access to information that's in the prescription drug database, they just need a warrant. They get a warrant, that's fine. And the Senate said, nope, we think they should be able to sit down in front of a monitor or work through somebody who would give them the information they need, but they don't need to have a warrant. Because they disagreed, no bill was passed, and guess what? A year later, the same thing is happening all over. This morning I was in the Senate Judiciary Committee listening to testimony, again, about the very same things that were talked about last year involving the prescription drug monitoring system, as it's called. Because no bill was passed last year, they're back this year trying to pass another one. And warrantless access, whether police can have access to information in the database without a warrant or not, has actually come up again as an issue that I'm going to guess will once again be contentious throughout the rest of the session. I'm bringing this up not to tell you this is what privacy is all about. It is about whether police can access personal information about you without first getting a warrant. In prescription drug records or medical records, they actually, because of what the prescription drug is and how often you're taking it, can tell a lot about your personal health and can tell a lot about you. So if you think about somebody who doesn't particularly like you and wants to make sure you have a very short political campaign, they might be interested in the fact that you've been taking antidepressants for the last 6 years. If somebody wants to really do you in, they might be interested to know that you've actually been dependent on OxyContin for the last 3 years. So there's all sorts of things that can be revealed through medical records, especially prescription drug records. But the really bigger issue is the issue of the creation of digital data by government and by private entities, and how the data is stored and where it's stored, and who has access to it, and under what conditions people have access to it. One of the things that you might want to do when you're walking out is to pick up what we call a focus piece. We developed these for the ACLU newsletter, and they're sort of individual articles. It's only one page, two sides, that talks in everyday language about a particular issue. And a few years ago, when the issue of data aggregation was starting to get a lot of attention, we thought we should really try to make this understandable to people if we can. So a good deal of what I'm going to talk about is also discussed in general terms in this particular focus piece. So on the way out, if you want something to sort of take with you to remember some of the key points, that's it. Data aggregation is the whole process of creating, storing, and accessing large amounts of electronic information. You can sort of think of data aggregation as akin to creating a library with books on a certain topic. But the books are really not books, they're bytes of data, digital bytes of data, and they're scattered all over. They're scattered in government computers when you pay your taxes or get a driver's license or a passport. All that information is on file in a computer, a government computer somewhere. They're in bank computers. When you go to open a financial account, your information is there, withdraw money, deposit money, all those things. The computer is behind how that system works. And if you go to a supermarket and you use a loyalty card, a Shaw's card, whatever your particular store where you shop calls them, that information is being stored. Every time that you purchase a certain product and the next time you come to the store and you realize, oh, I just got a 50-cent off coupon for Chobani to encourage you to buy more of the yogurt. All of that is because the information that you gave them through using the loyalty card has been stored and is being used to create a profile of you and the things that you like and might be encouraged to spend more money on. If you use Google Mail or you do searches on your computer using Google, you probably noticed that if you Google Mediterranean several times, before you know it, on the side of your computer you're getting ads for trips to the Mediterranean. On cruise ships, maybe a special deal on Alitalia Airlines to get you to the Italian Mediterranean. All that is because of how data aggregation works. So when it comes to privacy, privacy was once protected by what's called circumstance. And here is an example of privacy protected by circumstance. Records used to be, and some still are, on paper. And they were kept in file cabinets, and they were behind locked office doors. Records were hard and expensive to store, duplicate, and transmit. And you can probably guess what I'm going to say next, and that's that the digitization of information changed all that. And here's how the digitization of information changed it. First of all, the production of information, typing out a record about somebody, became incredibly easy because of computers. The next thing that happened was that duplication became very easy too. That's simply when you want to print a document, you just tap a couple of keys on your computer, print screen comes up, and if you're connected to a relatively cheap printer, you get a copy of whatever you've written in seconds. But lots of times we no longer even print out, we no longer duplicate our information. Instead, we distribute it. And distributing information has become a breeze because of the World Wide Web. And we often don't think about this anymore, but you know, it wasn't all that long ago that getting a document to somebody else before fax machines, before FedEx, and before the web was really hard to do. You basically used the US mail, and if you wanted to get it fast, If you wanted to get it there fast, you either hired a courier or you paid FedEx a lot of extra money to get it there. Now, you can easily scan even a paper document, put it in your computer, send it to somebody by email, and it can be there in a minute if you're fast with using a scanner. It's very, very different than things used to be. The other really important thing that's happened in the last 30 years in terms of information is this, and that is cheap memory. Storage of information has gotten cheaper and cheaper and cheaper. How cheap? This is how cheap. In 1980, it cost you $500,000 to store a gigabyte of information. $500,000. Today, that same gigabyte is about 5 cents. I mean, this is, I think if there's any one statistic that tells the story about how information has changed, this one does. What this means, among other things, is that for the most part, it's now longer cheaper to store everything that's ever been created electronically, digitally, than it is to get rid of it, because the memory is so cheap. So indeed, probably everything that you've ever created in digital form exists somewhere because storage is so cheap. If you've uploaded the document and sent it to somebody, it exists somewhere on backup files for Google or Yahoo. Your work computer, probably all sorts of stuff you thought were erased are still in deep memory in those computers. If you do backup at work, it's obviously kept on some backup server somewhere in the cloud or whatever. But this has been a truly astounding development that a lot of people don't think about. We just think it's neat to have a thumb drive, and we don't think about what that really means. What privacy we have left is not what information about us doesn't exist, but it's the difficulty of sorting through so much information about us that is in some sense creating privacy. There's so much information that it's difficult for tools to have been developed to sort through this information quickly and easily. The other way that our privacy is protected is by the rules that we, generally through our government, but sometimes through contracts that we have with private vendors, the rules that we place on data and data aggregation. Again, these rules are basic things like who has access to what and under which conditions. Let me go back to the first of those protections I just talked about, the difficulty of sorting through all the information that's being collected about us. Even that is actually eroding. Take a look at this article from 7 Days, one of Vermont's weekly papers in the Burlington area. This came out last year in the summertime, July of 2012, and the headline was Vermont Department of Motor Vehicles to use facial recognition software on all new driver's license photos and IDs. Facial recognition software is a tool, that can be used to search not for words or numbers, but for images. And when you think about it, one of the things that protects your privacy is the fact that even though your face is not unique in the way it's made up, we often see people who look like us, sometimes very much like us, to the point that we call them a double. But an image can be taken of your face, a photograph, and then put into digital form. So we're not talking about an image the way you think of a picture. We're actually talking about bytes of data, ones and zeros essentially. And when you have reduced somebody's face, somebody's image, to a digital algorithm essentially, you can search for that digital footprint through big databases of information. So someday what's going to happen, and we're actually not all that far away from it, there's going to be a way for my image to be found digitally through facial recognition software from mountains of surveillance tape that maybe was taken when I entered a government building, maybe it was taken when I went into my bank or went to the ATM to get some cash, maybe when I went to a school board meeting this morning and there was a camera at the school. At some point, it's going to be possible for these systems to be linked together, and at some point, it's going to be possible, even though there is so much information on video footage, using facial recognition software, you're going to be able to find all the images of me and to track where I was during the day. Already, if you have a computer that has the Windows 7 operating system, there's facial recognition system built within that operating system. So if you call up a picture of, say, yourself, and you ask the program to make a digital image of the picture, you can then have the computer sort through all your files to find the same image. And I've done that to myself in this computer, and it's pretty amazing how many pictures of me it can find, no matter what I'm doing. It's able to read my face in a way that's really quite accurate. So that's the first line of defense in protecting privacy that's eroding. You know, the privacy of obscurity extends to the inability of technology to keep up with all the information it has about us. When you get to something like facial recognition software, you may no longer be able to hide as easily, thinking all these images that are collected about you can't be put together in a portrait of where you're moving during the day, during the week, during the year. But as I say, that kind of privacy is quickly eroding because of technology. The second of the protections that I talked about was rules and regulations. And those protections are based on something very different. They're not based on circumstance. They're based on a long tradition that's really been a core value of our society for literally centuries. We Americans have long resisted government intrusion in our lives. We've long treasured our privacy. And if you don't think that's true, you just have to remember images like this that you've probably seen in history books. This is from the pre-revolutionary days in America in the 18th century. A British tax collector has been captured by probably some committee of safety somewhere in New England, patriots who are against the British imposition of taxes. He has been stripped of his clothing, he has been tarred, which you can sort of see evidence of on his legs there, and then he has been covered in feathers. A very painful thing, I gather, to have happen to you. And he's being made to drink something, I'm not sure what it is, and in the background is a noose that's hanging from a tree. So this is all because, this is all actually because of privacy, that this person was treated this way. It was about taxes, but the taxes were about privacy. Privacy springs from general English law before colonists came to the States, and the whole concept that a man's home is his castle. That notion of privacy was colored by some of the specific experiences that American colonists had by government, formed an important part of colonial resistance to British rule. The drafters of the Fourth Amendment, on which many privacy rights are based, actually had a specific case in mind when the Bill of Rights was drawn up following the Revolution and the adoption of the Constitution. It's actually a great story. It's this case from the late 1700s involved what were called writs of assistance. And these were orders that British officials used to enforce smuggling laws. Smuggling was a major problem for the British. The colonists smuggled many goods to avoid the various taxes that Parliament in London had imposed on the colonies, the sugar tax, the stamp tax, the tea tax. The writs were general, universal, perpetual, and transferable search warrants. They basically allowed British customs officials to enter homes and businesses at will, to seize virtually any property, and they didn't have a specific duration in time. There was a British attorney at the time. I could just as well, I guess, say an American attorney, but he was actually, James Otis, was an advocate general in the British Crown's Vice Admiralty Court. Otis was so offended by the writs that he resigned his position. The Boston merchants, Otis practiced law in Boston, who were in the forefront of colonial resistance to King George, hired Otis to challenge these writs of assistance. During the trial, Otis called the writs, quote, "the worst instrument of arbitrary power, the most destructive of English liberty and the fundamental principles of law that ever was found in an English law book," unquote. One of the people who was sitting in the courtroom at the time while Otis argued this case in the writs of assistance was a young lawyer by the name of John Adams. The ideas that he heard then spawned the Fourth Amendment 30 years later. In fact, Adams later said, there in that courtroom was the idea of liberty formed. So here's really what is at the heart of the Fourth Amendment. I mean, I think you all know what the Fourth Amendment says, and it's printed on the bookmark. I passed that to you. But the U.S. Supreme Court, in a case in 1961, Silverman versus United States, said, at the very core of the Fourth Amendment stands the right of a man to retreat into his own home and there be free from unreasonable government intrusion. So there is this notion that we should be free of unreasonable searches by the government only if government has probable cause that we've committed a crime, and only if government has gone to a judge, convinced the judge that I've probably committed a crime. Can the judge issue a warrant to go into my home, or also to go into other places where I might have information that would be evidence of the crime? The home is considered to have one of the highest protections when it comes to searches and seizures. And that's because of this doctrine of a man's home, a person's home, is his or her castle. I think you can probably see where I'm going with this. If James Otis were alive today, he'd probably be struggling to comprehend the challenges to privacy that are posed by computers, the internet, and data aggregation. It's really hard to think of somebody like James Otis, John Adams, Paul Revere, George Washington, even encountering a computer. I have no idea how they would react. I think they'd probably wonder how you put protections into law for information that's virtual rather than real, information that doesn't exist in the real sense, and it's in bytes instead of on paper. And it's even outside of our homes and outside of our places of business. Information before used to be contained in people's homes, their business, maybe the church, maybe a law court. But generally, it existed, and information now really doesn't exist in the same form. It's in digital form. So at the ACLU, we've tried to protect privacy from digital technologies by insisting that clear rules be established about the collection and the use of data. I'm going to move this mic a bit to see if I can get rid of that, some of that sound. See if it's any better. So let me give you an example of what we've been trying to do, and this is in the area of something maybe you know something about, but I'll run you through what it is. This is a smart meter, and the electric utilities around the state are installing these on most of our homes and businesses. They look an awful lot like the old what are called analog meters that we've had in our homes for many, many years. But if you look in the center where you can see the readout, you see that it's not a series of numbers on a dial like a clock face, and you don't see that rotating disc at the bottom turning around faster or slower according to how much electricity you use. Instead, you just see a bunch of numbers on a digital readout. This is what's important about smart meters. Again, we're in the world of digital information, so there's a lot more you can do with a smart meter. The most important thing you can do is you can get a much more detailed portrait of how people are using electricity. Your traditional meter displays usage on a longer term basis. And if you have in the past or maybe now been a member of a co-op, you might even have to read your own meter. I know I've had to do that with Washington Electric Co-op. I'm a co-op customer. And it was only about 10 years ago maybe that Washington Electric Co-op switched to a system of meter readers. Before that, we all used to go out to our meter, supposedly once a month, and we would send in the number from the meter that would tell how many hours of electricity we had used, kilowatt hours, and then we get billed for that amount. Washington Electric realized that this system wasn't always working well because there were some of us who didn't read our meters on a regular basis. And they also realized that when you let people read their own meters, people tend to read them at different times. Most people were not getting the postcard that said it's time to read your meter, fill in here, and run outside and do it. Like other pieces of mail we get, you put it on the kitchen table or kitchen counter, and maybe in the next month you'll think about it, and then you'll go out and read your meter and send it in. So it made cash flow at the co-op incredibly unpredictable. And they found when they switched to monthly meter readings by meter readers that the money flow evened out quite a bit and made it a lot easier for them to manage their business. Smart meters, however, can read your electrical usage much more frequently. The most sophisticated ones can read them on almost a continuous, ongoing basis. Most of the ones being installed now, though, in our homes read about every 15 minutes how many kilowatt hours you're using. There are several different layers to how smart meters can work and will be able to work in the future. Some people are getting into more sophisticated systems than others, so I need to explain both of them. Even using a very basic smart meter, one that's not particularly sophisticated, it's possible to identify which appliances you're using and at what time of day, because each appliance generates what's called a unique electric load signature. The National Institute of Standards and Technology wrote in 2010 that research shows analyzing 15-minute interval aggregate household energy consumption data can by itself pinpoint the use of most major home appliances. Let me show you and then I'll go back to the other slide. So this is actually a chart that was produced by the National Institute of Standards and Technology, and without any communication between a specific appliance and the smart meter, simply analyzing these different lines of electrical usage, somebody who is good at this can actually tell what the signature refers to. It's probably pretty hard for you to see what's up there, but this represents a refrigerator. This represents a kettle. This represents I believe it's a toaster, if I remember. This is a washing machine, and it goes on and on. If you know what you're looking for, you can actually read these signatures. This is a relatively crude form of a smart meter, but it's still getting inside your house in a way that the electric company has never been able to do before. The Department of Energy has concluded that just by looking at electrical usage information, it can reveal the daily schedules of the people in the homes, including the times when they're at or away from home or asleep, whether they've got alarm systems, whether they own expensive electronic equipment, such as plasma TVs, and whether they use certain types of medical equipment. So let me tell you what's going to happen as smart meters get smarter. Eventually, appliances we buy are going to be equipped with a chip, an RFID chip, a radio frequency identification chip. And this little chip, they've already become quite cheap, is going to be used to communicate with the smart meter that's on your house. And it will smart meter and it will be collected. The other thing that's going to happen eventually is the smart meter is going to be able to turn that appliance on and off to regulate the use. And because the smart meter can do it, the utility can do it. The way a smart meter works, smart meter is replacing the usual meter that you've had on your house, just replacing something that was there. It is then communicating the information it collects to the utility's headquarters in one of two ways. It could be communicating it over a radio transmission, and that's called a wireless smart meter. Or it could be communicating it over a traditional copper wire, and that's called a wired or a hardwired smart meter. It doesn't matter in terms of the information which system is used. There are some people who believe very strongly that the wireless smart meters, the ones that are using radio waves, have adverse health effects, that some people are affected by the radio waves that will be constantly emitted by these things. They're like the radio waves that are emitted by cell phones. So if you're bothered by cell phone waves, and some people are, you're very likely going to be bothered by the waves, the radio waves that are emitted by smart meters. And that's why some people have been insisting that they have an option either to not have the smart meter installed in their home, or if one is, that it be a wired, hardwired meter and not a wireless meter. But eventually what's going to happen is the devices in your home will be talking to the smart meter. That will probably be done through a low-level wireless connection between your washing machine or refrigerator and the smart meter. And what's in it for the utility is the ability to regulate in a more even fashion the flow, the need, the demand for electricity throughout the system. Electric rates are based on peak power demands. Peak power is the most expensive power a utility has to buy. It has to plan for those peak demand periods, and it has to line up power in advance so the utility can supply the power that's needed. If it can't, I mean, you've seen what happens. We have brownouts and then finally blackouts. And those become really expensive because then damage is done to the whole grid. So the theory is this, that if you have a smart meter and you have a sophisticated smart meter in a few years, you're going to be offered a deal. And the deal is that if you agree to have your refrigerator turned off during a peak power demand period in the summer or the winter, you'll be able to buy electricity at a reduced rate. And you think, well, wait a minute, how this is going to work? How is this going to work? If they turn off my refrigerator in the summertime, I mean, the stuff in the freezer is going to spoil, right? No, it's actually very simple and very clever what's going to happen. If you get 10,000 people to sign up to have their refrigerator turned off for 2 minutes during a peak power alert, and even if it's on the hottest day of July, what will happen is those people will have their refrigerators turned off, but not all at the same time. So the people who live in St. Johnsbury will have their refrigerators turned off for 2 minutes at 2 o'clock. At 2:02, the people in Danville will have their refrigerators turned off for 2 minutes. At 2:04, the people in Plainfield will have their refrigerators turned off for 2 minutes. So you're going to have an even reduction over a period of time that could last up to an hour or two, even though your refrigerator is only being turned off for 2 minutes. That's going to be enough for the power company to reduce the demand and probably avoid having to pay for really expensive peaking power. The other thing that some people think will happen is that you might be able to buy power from the utility when it's cheap and sell it back when it's expensive. And one way you might be able to do this is if you have a Prius. If you have an electric car or hybrid, if you want to charge your car in the middle of the night when power is cheap, and then because you know you're not going to use the car the next day, sell the power back to the utility the next afternoon when it gets hot and there's peaking power alert, you might be able to get another reduction on your bill. So you have to think of this grid, this electric grid, as becoming smart, and not just in terms of what the utility can do, but also what you can do. And I think if you're an engineer, you get fascinated by this stuff. I mean, I'm kind of fascinated by this stuff. And I'm not an engineer. But the problem is that in order to do all this, all sorts of information is being collected about us. And some of the people who are going to be very interested in this information is what are often called third parties. And third parties are people like folks who make washing machines. If they can determine that you have a 1981 Kenmore washing machine that likely was a wedding present from your parents 30 years ago, they might think, gee, it really is time for the Gilbert Richardson household to have a new washing machine, because their washing machine, we can convince them, is terribly inefficient. So I might all of a sudden, based on an analysis of the electrical patterns and information that can be gotten about my washing machine, start receiving ads from Sears about washing machine specials. If you're using medical equipment, the same sort of thing. An insurance company might be very interested in the fact that you're using some medical equipment. I think you've probably all started to encounter what people talk about, a black box in a car that records your driving habits. Well, if you can think of appliances in your home that are doing the same sort of thing by the fact you're using them, you get an idea of how all of a sudden information about how you live your life in your home, your private life in your private home, is being sent out to other people. It becomes very, very valuable. One of the problems is law enforcement wants this information. Law enforcement probably would really like to know if for some reason you have a very high electrical usage pattern in the middle of the night. From, say, sundown until sunup, every day of the week for weeks on end, might you be growing marijuana in your basement? I've been talking a little bit about private companies and third parties. They will have information from a consumer marketing standpoint. They're going to know more and more about you, and just as Google collects information about what you do on the web, using smart meters and the electric grid will allow them to collect information about what you do in your house. And then the other big problem is going to be problems with hackers. There have already been some examples of hackers hacking into smart grids run by utility companies and doing all sorts of mischief. One of the examples I read was about these two young guys in Germany had hacked into the system of a German utility, and they could actually make the system think that they were consuming no electricity, in fact that they were producing electricity. And they were able to produce a bill that showed a credit of several hundred euros for somebody's house, even though it was obviously crazy. So, what we've been trying to do with smart meters here in Vermont is we first went to the legislature and said we really have to have privacy protections in place about the collection of this data. We recognize it's not government that's collecting the data, it's private companies, it's utilities, but utilities are regulated by the government. So the government has an interest, the public has a right to have those interests protected. And the legislature is one way to do it. And we started working on this about 3 years ago, and at that point nobody had even heard about the smart meters and the smart grid. This was something that was happening out in California among some of the utilities out there, and the ACLU affiliates on the West Coast were telling us about it. So we couldn't get we couldn't get the legislature interested. But we went to the Public Service Department, which is the consumer side of utility regulation in the state. And they understood what a smart grid and smart meters were because there had actually been a docket, a case, that had been opened before the Public Service Board back in 2007 by the utilities. The utilities knew about smart meters, smart grids, and they wanted to start planning for when they could eventually build a smart grid in Vermont. But the utilities realized shortly after filing the intent to do something to build a smart grid system that they needed so much money to swap out everybody's meters that there was no way they were going to be able to do this. Then, in 2008 and 2009, if you remember, we had an incredible financial collapse, and the government decided it had to get a lot more money moving in the economy. It had to make funds available for all sorts of new investments, be it in health, IT, health information technology, digital medical records, or be it in smart grids. Everybody recognized that the U.S.'s electrical grid system, from you and me, to give to the utilities to swap out our meters, the old meters for the new smart meters. So at this point, it's pretty clear that not only does government have an interest in what the utilities are doing, but we all